The courtroom smelled like floor polish and old paper. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a flat, lifeless glow across everything. Jack Dunbar stood near the back table, with his hands folded in front of him, the way a man stands when he has already accepted the punch is coming but refuses to flinch. He was 64 years old. Broad shoulders, worn hands, a face carved by decades of sun and wind and things most people only read about in books. 30 years in the army, 2 combat deployments, and a Purple Heart tucked away in a shoebox somewhere. None of that mattered in this room. Across the aisle, his wife of 26 years sat beside a man Jack had never seen before last summer. His name was Craig Weston, a commercial real estate developer with tanned skin and an expensive suit. Craig's hand rested casually on the table near Victoria's arm, not quite touching, but close enough to say everything it needed to say. Victoria looked different. Lighter, somehow. Straighter. She had changed her hair, new earrings, a confidence about her posture that hadn't been there during the last few years of their marriage. Or maybe it had been there all along, just directed away from him. The judge, a gray-haired woman with reading glasses balanced on her nose, spoke evenly as she read through the final decree. The primary residence, she said, retirement accounts, vehicle assets, and liquid savings will be awarded to Victoria Dunbar, per the agreed settlement terms. Jack felt each word land inside his chest like a stone dropped into deep water. He didn't move. He didn't blink. A man who had held position under mortar fire in Fallujah knew how to absorb pain without showing it. Mr. Dunbar will retain sole ownership of the rural property in Harney County, Oregon. A parcel of approximately 40 acres with a single uninhabitable structure, previously belonging to Mr. Dunbar's late uncle. Victoria's attorney leaned forward. The property holds no utilities, no road access, and carries a county tax assessment below $1,200. My client considers this equitable. Equitable. Jack let the word sit in his mouth like something bitter. He hadn't visited that land in almost 15 years. His uncle Henry had bought it back in the 80s, planning to build a fishing lodge near the high desert lakes. The lodge never materialized. Henry passed away from a stroke during a winter ice storm, alone in his apartment in Bend. The land transferred to Jack, who was stationed at Fort Campbell at the time. He had signed some papers, filed them away, and never thought about it again. Now that forgotten patch of sagebrush and volcanic rock was the only thing in the world that belonged to him. The judge tapped her gavel. This decree is final. Jack exhaled through his nose. 26 years. Gone in under 3 minutes. At his feet, lying flat against the courtroom floor, a large Belgian Malinois remained absolutely still. His name was Ranger. He was 11 years old, brown and black with a graying muzzle and deep amber eyes that tracked every movement in the room. Ranger had been a military working dog, explosive detection. He'd served alongside Jack during his last deployment before being retired from duty due to a torn ligament. Jack had adopted him the same week the dog was scheduled for euthanasia at a military kennel. That had been 9 years ago. Now Ranger lifted his head and pressed his nose against Jack's knee. Jack rested his hand on the dog's skull. "Easy," he whispered. Victoria stood and gathered her purse. Craig placed a hand on her lower back as they turned toward the door. She glanced at Jack once. Her expression wasn't cruel exactly. It was the look of someone who had already moved several miles past a place and could barely see it in the rearview mirror anymore. "You'll be fine out there," she said. "It's quiet. Might be good for you." Craig smiled faintly and added, "Fresh air, right? Probably therapeutic." Jack said nothing. Therapeutic. A man who had never spent a night outside his climate-controlled office was now offering advice about healing. Victoria turned and walked through the heavy courtroom doors. Her heels clicked against the marble hallway, growing fainter with each step. Craig followed, already scrolling through his phone. Jack stood there for a long moment. The clerk shuffled papers behind the bench. The room felt enormous and empty at the same time. Ranger stood and leaned his body against Jack's leg. Jack looked down at him. "You and me, pal." Ranger's tail moved once, slow, certain. Jack picked up the thin envelope containing the deed and walked out of the courthouse. Before we begin this incredible story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? The drive from Burns took Jack deep into a part of Oregon most people didn't know existed. East of the Cascades, the landscape opened into something vast and severe. Sagebrush stretched in every direction. The sky sat impossibly wide overhead, pale and dry. Volcanic ridges rose in the distance like the spines of ancient creatures buried just below the surface. Jack drove his old Chevy truck along a two-lane highway that eventually narrowed into a gravel road. Then the gravel turned to dirt. Then the dirt became two ruts pressed into hard desert ground. Ranger sat in the passenger seat with his head near the window, nose twitching at the unfamiliar smells. Juniper, mineral dust, dry creek mud, cold rock. After nearly 2 hours, the ruts ended at a rusted cattle gate hanging open on a broken hinge. Jack stopped the truck and stepped out. Wind pushed against him immediately, dry and steady, carrying the sharp scent of sage and something metallic he couldn't name. Beyond the gate, the land sloped gently upward toward a ridge of dark basalt rock. Sparse junipers dotted the hillside, and sitting at the base of that ridge, halfway hidden behind a stand of twisted trees, was the structure. It was smaller than Jack had expected. A single-story cabin built from rough timber and corrugated metal roofing. The roof had collapsed on one side, leaving a gaping hole where rain and snow had been pouring in for years. The front door was missing entirely. 2 windows gaped like empty eye sockets. The entire building leaned slightly eastward, as if the wind had been slowly pushing it over for decades. Jack stared at it for a long time. "Fresh air," he muttered. "Probably therapeutic." Ranger jumped down from the truck and immediately began circling the area. Nose low, muscles alert, scanning the terrain exactly the way he had been trained to clear zones overseas. Jack followed the dog toward the cabin. The ground crunched under his boots, a mix of dried mud and volcanic gravel. Each step sent small puffs of dust into the still afternoon air. The cabin's interior was worse than the outside suggested. Rodent droppings covered the floor. The remaining section of roof let in gray light that revealed warped floorboards, a collapsed shelf unit, and a stone hearth built into the far wall. The hearth was the only thing that looked solid, heavy basalt blocks stacked with old-fashioned precision. Uncle Henry might have been a dreamer, but whoever had originally built this fireplace knew exactly what they were doing. Jack set his duffel bag down and ran a hand along the stone. "Still good," he said quietly. Ranger sniffed along the wall, pausing at corners, investigating every crack. Then the dog returned to Jack and sat beside him, looking up as if waiting for orders. Jack crouched and held Ranger's face in both hands. "I know it's not much," he said, "but nobody's shooting at us. That's something." Ranger's tail brushed the dusty floor. That first night, Jack patched the worst of the roof with a tarp and built a fire in the old hearth, using juniper branches he gathered from the clearing. The wood burned hot and fast, filling the cabin with a sharp, sweet smoke. He heated a can of chili over the flames and ate sitting on the floor, with his back against the stone wall. Ranger lay beside him. The fire cast dancing orange light across the cabin walls and threw long shadows that shifted and swayed. Outside, the high desert night was absolute. No streetlights, no passing cars, no sound at all except the wind and, somewhere far off, the low call of a coyote. Jack closed his eyes. For a moment, the crackling fire sounded wrong. Not wood burning. Something else. A sound from years ago. Radio static, shouting. The distant thud of an explosive charge detonating against concrete. His hands tightened involuntarily. His breathing shortened. Then a warm weight pressed against his chest. Ranger had moved without Jack noticing. The dog pushed his head firmly into Jack's ribs, steady and deliberate, the way he always did when the episodes came. Jack opened his eyes. The cabin returned, the fire, the stone wall, the Oregon night. He placed a hand on Ranger's back. "Good boy," he whispered. The dog didn't move. He stayed pressed against Jack's body until the breathing slowed and the trembling in Jack's hands finally stopped. They slept on the floor that night, side by side. The fire burned down to embers. The coyotes fell silent. And somewhere inside the walls of that broken cabin something waited. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. The next few days blurred together in a rhythm of labor and silence. Jack woke before sunrise each morning, the same way he had for 40 years. He patched the roof section by section. He cleared debris from the cabin floor. He hauled stones from the hillside to rebuild a collapsed section of the outer wall. His hands cracked and bled. His back ached in ways it hadn't since his 20s. But the work did something to his mind that surprised him. It quieted the noise. The ghosts that usually followed him through the daylight hours seemed to stay farther back when his hands were busy. Not gone, never gone, but farther away. Ranger helped in his own way. He carried sticks. He sat nearby and watched every hammer strike with patient attention. And each morning, he made his patrol around the clearing, circling the cabin twice before returning to Jack with a soft bark that seemed to say, "All clear." On the 5th morning, Jack discovered the spring. He had followed Ranger down a shallow ravine behind the cabin where the dog had been drinking from a trickle of water running over dark stone. Jack knelt and tasted it, cold, clean, mineral sharp. He traced the flow uphill to where it emerged from a crack in the basalt ridge. Good water, desert spring water, the kind that could run year-round if the source was deep enough. Jack sat back on his heels and looked at the ridge above him. His uncle had never mentioned a spring. Then again, Uncle Henry had only visited this land a handful of times before he died. That afternoon, Jack was replacing rotted boards along the cabin's back wall. The sun was high and the air smelled like heated stone and sage. Ranger lay in the shade of a juniper tree nearby, half dozing. Jack pried loose a warped plank near the base of the wall, then another. The wood was soft and dark, with years of moisture seeping up from the ground. He reached for a third plank. Ranger's head snapped up. He knew that posture. Ears forward, body rigid, nose locked onto a single point. It was the same alert Ranger had given hundreds of times in combat zones when he detected something hidden. Jack looked at the dog. "What is it?" Ranger stood and walked quickly to the spot where Jack had been working. The dog pressed his nose against the exposed section of wall and began pawing at the wood, not casually, urgently, the way he had been trained to signal a find. Jack's pulse quickened. He trusted Ranger's instincts more than his own. He had seen this dog locate buried ordnance under 3 feet of packed earth. If Ranger said something was there, something was there. Jack grabbed the pry bar and carefully worked another board free. Behind it was a dark gap wider than a normal wall cavity. Cold air breathed out from the opening, carrying a musty mineral smell. Jack shined his flashlight into the space. The beam cut through dust and landed on something solid. A metal container, rectangular, about the size of a large toolbox wedged into a hollowed-out section between the wall studs. Jack stared. His hand stopped moving. Ranger barked once, sharp, proud. Jack reached into the cavity with both hands and gripped the container. It was heavy. Rust flaked off against his palms as he dragged it out into the daylight. The hinges were corroded shut. The latch had fused with age. Jack sat down on the ground beside the box. Ranger pressed against his shoulder, tail wagging steadily. Jack used the pry bar to crack the latch. The lid groaned and opened. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had turned dark brown with age, were documents, dozens of them. Yellowed paper, hand-drawn maps, handwritten ledger pages covered in neat, slanting script. And beneath the papers, nestled in a bed of cloth, were rock samples, 8 or 9 of them. Rough-edged stones that glinted with a dull metallic luster when Jack turned them in the sunlight. Jack unfolded one of the maps. His eyes moved across the faded ink lines, tracing topography he recognized. The ridge behind the cabin, the ravine, the spring, and marked in the center of the map, circled in red ink that had faded to rust. 2 words that made Jack breath catch. Copper deposit. Jack sat very still. He looked at the ridge, then back at the map, then at Ranger, who was watching him with steady amber eyes. "Buddy," Jack said softly, "I think your uncle's land just got a lot more interesting." Ranger wagged his tail and nudged the box with his nose, as if to say, "You're welcome." Jack didn't sleep much that night. He spread the documents across the cabin floor and read them by firelight. The handwriting belonged to a man named Josiah Kemp, a prospector who had surveyed this land in 1891. Kemp's notes described a significant copper vein running through the basalt ridge, exposed in several locations along the eastern face. He had collected ore samples, drawn detailed maps, and written letters to potential investors back east. But the last letter in the collection, dated March 1893, told the rest of the story: financial collapse. The investors had pulled out during the economic panic. Kemp's funding dried up. The mine was never opened. The documents were sealed inside the cabin wall, presumably for safekeeping, and forgotten. For over 130 years, Jack leaned against the hearth and rubbed his eyes. The fire had burned low. Ranger lay curled beside him, breathing slowly. Jack looked at the rock samples again. Even in the dim light, the copper-green streaks were unmistakable. "Victoria thought she gave me nothing," he whispered. Ranger's ear twitched. Jack shook his head slowly. "But I need to be sure." The next morning, Jack drove 90 minutes to the town of Lakeview, a quiet place nestled near the California border. He found a small geology office on the main street, run by a woman named Jean Aldrich. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, with calloused hands that said she spent more time on rock faces than behind a desk. Jack laid the ore samples and maps across her desk without preamble. Jean examined the samples under a magnifying lens. Then she ran two through a portable spectrometer. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the machine and the click of Jean's boots against the concrete floor. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed entirely. "Where exactly did you find these?" "Old cabin on my property. Harney County. Dog found them inside the wall." Jean set down the sample carefully. "This is high-grade copper ore," she said, "the kind of grade that mining companies spend years looking for." Jack felt the air shift in the room. "How significant?" Jean pointed at the map. "If this survey is even half accurate, and it looks carefully done, you could be sitting on a deposit worth serious money. Not a hobby mine, a real deposit." Jack stared at the map on her desk. The red circle stared back at him. The same circle Josiah Kemp had drawn 130 years ago. Outside in the truck, Ranger waited with his head out the window, watching the door. Jack thanked Jean and drove home in silence. His mind moved the way it always had when processing new intelligence. Slowly, carefully, no assumptions, no excitement, just facts. The facts were these. He owned 40 acres of high desert land that nobody wanted. Beneath that land, a copper vein had been waiting since before Oregon was even a state, and the only reason he knew about it was because an old Belgian Malinois had done what he was trained to do: detect what was hidden. Over the following weeks, Jack began exploring the ridge with renewed purpose. He marked locations where Kemp's maps matched the actual terrain. He chipped samples from exposed rock faces and sent them to Jean for analysis. Each report came back stronger than the last. The vein was real, it was deep, and it was rich. Jack worked slowly. He reinforced the cabin. He improved the road access. He installed a small solar panel for power and dug a proper channel from the spring for clean water. The property began to look less like an abandoned ruin and more like a place where someone actually lived. Ranger's limp from an old injury grew slightly more pronounced as the weeks passed, but the dog never slowed down. He patrolled the perimeter every morning. He sat beside Jack at the ridge every afternoon, and every night he pressed himself against Jack's side when the nightmares came, anchoring him to the present with the simple weight of loyalty. Then, on a cold morning in late October, Jack heard an engine coming up the dirt road. Ranger stood immediately. The hair along his spine rose. A black SUV appeared through the juniper trees. New, expensive. Jack recognized the vehicle before it even stopped. Two doors opened. Victoria stepped out first. Her coat was too clean for the desert, her shoes too polished for the gravel. Behind her came a man Jack didn't recognize, younger, briefcase, the posture of someone who had spent his career in conference rooms. Victoria stopped a few yards from the cabin. Her eyes moved across the property, the patched roof, the solar panel, the marked stakes. "Orange." "Jack," she said, "Victoria." She folded her arms. I've been hearing things. Jack leaned against the porch rail. People talk. The man with the briefcase stepped forward. Mr. Dunbar, I'm Nathan Cole, attorney representing Mrs. Dunbar. We believe there may have been an oversight in the original settlement regarding subsurface mineral rights. Jack looked at him steadily. There wasn't. Victoria's voice sharpened. You expect me to believe that worthless piece of desert just happened to have a copper mine under it? I expect you to believe what the judge signed, Jack said. Ranger moved to Jack's side. The dog stood perfectly still, watching the visitors with the focused intensity of an animal who understood threat assessment better than most humans. Victoria glanced at the dog. She had never liked Ranger. Too intense, she had once said, too much like his owner. Jack reached into the cabin door and pulled out a manila folder. He handed it to the attorney. Nathan Cole opened it. Inside were copies of the original divorce decree, the property transfer documents, and a highlighted section of Oregon property law, confirming that mineral rights transferred with the land, unless explicitly, Jack's calmly. They weren't excluded, Jack said calmly. Your own attorney drafted the settlement. He didn't think the land was worth reviewing. Nathan Cole read the documents carefully. His face revealed nothing, but his silence said everything. Victoria stared at Jack. This isn't over. Jack met her eyes without anger, without bitterness, without the hollow feeling that had lived inside his chest for months after the divorce. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. The wind picked up across the clearing, sending a swirl of sage-scented dust between them. Victoria turned and walked back to the SUV. Nathan Cole followed without a word. Doors closed. The engine started. The vehicle disappeared down the dirt road in a cloud of beige dust. Jack watched until the sound faded completely. Ranger sat beside him and looked up. Jack scratched behind the dog's ears. She'll try again, he said. Ranger's tail swept the ground once. Jack looked toward the ridge, but it won't matter. It didn't. Over the next 2 years, Victoria's legal challenges were dismissed 3 times. Each ruling confirmed what Jack already knew. The land was his. The minerals were his. The law was clear. Jack didn't build an empire. That was never the point. He partnered with Gene Aldrich to develop a small-scale mining operation, environmentally careful, employing local workers from the surrounding communities. Men and women who needed work, former ranchers who had lost their land in droughts, a few veterans who had drifted into the region, looking for something they couldn't name. Jack understood those people. He had been one of them. The operation grew steadily, not explosively. Steadily. The way good things grow when they're built with patience instead of greed. Jack used the early profits to build 3 small cabins on the property. 1 for himself, replacing the original structure. 2 for workers who needed housing. Then a 4th. Then a 5th. By the 2nd year, a small community had formed around the ridge. People who worked together during the day and sat around fires in the evening, telling stories the way people used to before replaced campfires. Ranger became the unofficial mascot of the operation. Workers greeted him every morning. He inspected each new trench dug along the ridge with the seriousness of a foreman reviewing blueprints. When new veterans arrived, quiet and uncertain, Ranger seemed to find them first. He would sit beside them without prompting, pressing his body against their legs the way he pressed against Jack during the dark hours. Something about the dog's presence unlocked a door that words couldn't open. One evening, nearly 3 years after Jack had first driven through that rusted cattle gate, he sat on the porch of his cabin with a cup of coffee. The sun was setting behind the western ridgeline, painting the desert sky in shades of copper and bronze. The color seemed fitting. Ranger lay beside him. The dog was slower now. His muzzle was almost entirely gray. The old limp had become more noticeable, and he slept longer than he used to. But his eyes were the same, amber and steady and full of something that didn't require words. Jack set his coffee down and rested his hand on Ranger's back. "You remember that courtroom?" Jack asked softly. Ranger's ear turned toward the sound of Jack's voice. "She said the land wasn't worth anything. The evening wind carried the distant sound of laughter from one of the worker cabins. Someone was playing a guitar. The smell of grilling meat drifted across the clearing. Jack looked out at the ridge, then down at the old foundation where the original shack still stood. He had refused to demolish it. That ruin was where Ranger had pressed his nose against the wall and changed the course of everything. Jack spoke quietly. You know what? The copper's not the thing. Ranger shifted and rested his chin on Jack's knee. Jack's voice was barely above a whisper. The thing is right here. He meant the cabins with their warm lights. The veterans who had arrived broken and slowly found their footing. The workers who fed their families because of what a forgotten prospector buried inside a wall over a century ago. And the dog beside him who had detected what no one else could see. Not the copper hidden in the rock. The life hidden inside a man everyone had given up on. The desert night settled in around them. Stars appeared one by one across the enormous Oregon sky. More stars than most people ever see in a lifetime. Coyotes called from somewhere beyond the ridge. The guitar music faded into quiet conversation, then into silence. Ranger closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. His tail gave one last gentle sweep across the wooden porch. Jack didn't move. He sat there in the darkness with his hand on his dog's back, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not wealth, something much harder to find than copper in a desert ridge. Peace. Sometimes the most valuable thing in your life isn't buried underground. Sometimes it's the one who stayed beside you when everyone else walked away. Jack lost everything he thought mattered. But Ranger stayed, and that loyalty led them both to something no courtroom could take away. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you believe a loyal dog can truly change a person's life, type 1 in the comments. If you believe every veteran deserves a second chance, type 0. And tell us where you're watching from today. We're always amazed at how far these stories reach. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here at Brave Veteran Dogs, we share powerful stories about veterans, loyal dogs, and the moments that change everything. And trust me, the next story might surprise you even more.